Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Rabbi yassir wa a'in ya kareem waftah bil haqqi innaka al-fattahul alim. So we're resuming our consideration of what has already turned out to be a very extensive palette in our search for paradigms of leadership, having deconstructed and dissected this idea of leadership and tried to, as it were, discard from our scalpel all of those ego residues that go with the idea of being a leader, being up front, a kind of management guru mentality, or the heaven help us electoral contest syndromes, various ego manifestations of leadership we saw have no place in the context of religion, which in many ways turns the world and its paradigms exactly upside down. What happens when you value those who are not valued, when you are actually listening with the poor or being amongst the poor, when you do not like being upon the throne or the minbar or some other position of responsibility, and plead with God and with your associates to be taken away from these hazardous roles. Because the hadith says, كُلُّكُمْ رَاعٍ وَكُلُّكُمْ مَسْئُولٌ عَنْ رَعِيَّتِهِ. Each one of you is a shepherd, and each one of you is accountable for his flock. If the wolf comes along, or the sheep is sick and you don't notice, or the lamb is not looked after in the middle of the night, it's the shepherd's fault. Don't go blaming the government or a Zionist conspiracy or some other thing that you want to reduce your status as mas'ul, responsible. No, it's up to you. And kullukum ra', the Holy Prophet says, every one of you is a shepherd. Even if it just means keeping an eye on the toddler or feeding your cat or whatever it might be, there's always somebody for whose well-being you are responsible. And mas'ul, responsible in the literal sense of the word, in other words, having to give a response, to give an account, to explain how you discharged that responsibility. And sometimes it is just feeding the cat or looking after mum. Sometimes it's dealing with affairs of millions of people, spiritually or temporally, but in every case this shepherd hadith applies. And we've seen how characteristically Islamic is the way in which the human response to this weighty burden of responsibility has fluctuated in different times and places in the stately, magnificent, ever-diversifying, but nonetheless universal progress of the ummah in space and time. One of the things that we've been trying to get our heads around is this famous principle of what diversity means in the context of a religion that is so emphatic on ta'assi, in other words, following the prophetic uswa or example. It seems to be a specifically Islamic characteristic. In other religions, you don't quite get this idea of the painstaking, almost forensic imitatio. You don't really try to be like how Jesus kept his beard and how often he trimmed his fingernails and those sunnah things in the context of Christianity. Similarly, Judaism is not really about trying to be like Moses. The law is not that. It's something else. But in our all-embracing, final, khatam religion, we have this idea of excellence being specifically articulated in terms of the personal emulation of an ideal human being. Something very Islamic about this idea of sunnah, and sunnah doesn't translate terribly well into other linguistic, cultural, spiritual frames. It's hard to see how you'd use the word sunnah, how you'd find an English dictionary equivalent. It's something specifically Islamic. So on the one hand, we have this Islamic specificity of emulation, but on the other hand, we have the fact of a religion that is palpably embracing of all kinds of difference and diversity. And one of the ways in which we've reflected on this is by looking at the principle of prophetic emulation as precedent and boundary setter and expression of love, rather than, as it were, as the founding of an ideology. Important to remember that Islam calls itself deen and doesn't call itself ideology. That's a kind of 20th century aberration. Hizb al-Tahrir and so forth jump up and down and say Islam is an ideology. No, that word is not to be found in the Quranic dictionaries. Beware what you're doing if you try and reinvent the whole definition of what God's religion is, according to some 20th, or in this case, 18th century understanding of what a worldview might be. It comes from de Tracy in the 18th century, this idea of ideology. And lo and behold, he says, this is what we have when we don't have religion. We no longer believe in the church and the priests. Instead, we believe in humanity as a version of zoology. We're just part of matter. Very positivistic. And yet you get these Muslims nowadays jumping up and down and making themselves feel very modern and very political by saying, Islam is an ideology, the ideology of Islam. Why do they do that? Well, it's a sad insight into the apologetic inferiority complex. It sounds very modern and relevant if we call it an ideology, so let's go with that. But no, we use our own internal definitions, which presumably are the correct ones, and we say deen. So ideology partakes in science's tendency to reduce everything to a single pattern of explanations and outcomes. It's mathematical. There's only one proper answer to the quadratic equation. Deen, as opposed to this scientistic ideology, historically opens up humanity. Why? Because it's not really ultimately about the collisions of atoms and the forces that determine them, and then ultimately human behavior, dialectical materialism. Ideology is a big word for Marx. He's got the German ideology. It's one of the founding texts of Marxism. But instead, deen, which is about the spiritual connection of human beings to transcendence, partakes in the indefinite nature of the human spirit, the ruh. So if we're in ideology and we're interested in natural causation, and that's going to make us very anxious if things seem to be going wrong in the world, we are essentially reducing deen to the level of a materialistic ideology. And that's why a lot of modern Muslims go wrong, because they think, you've got a socialist republic, and you've got an Islamic republic, and they've got different ideologies, but Islam is more radical, different, deep than that, because it's ultimately about that which touches the most indefinable, unscientific part of us, which is the ruh, participates in the divine freedom, and hence is not reducible to a single mathematical calculus of cause, effect, outcomes, but is imponderable, different, and therefore deen becomes the cornucopia of incredible diversity and necessary indeterminacy in all but the most essential practices and doctrines. And this approximativity of the fiqh is one of the things that divides classical Islam from modernistic or Islamist forms of Islam. The pre-modern scholars were happy with fiqh as being the latest stage of the evolution of a discussion, and there's ikhtilaf, and we'll move on to something else. It's approximative. Whereas the ideologists want it to be like, Das Kapital, an absolute, fixed and eternally valid statement of class and money and human relations and how we should behave and how the government should be fixed. That's one of the interesting paradoxes of the Enlightenment. Science is to be the measure of all things. We're just thinking animals, but it's also about freedom, liberty, equality, fraternity. However, science is just about matter, and there's nothing about it that automatically is going to deliver freedom or humanism. might, but there's nothing intrinsically in it that's going to do that. In fact, it tends to limit everything in terms of laws, cause and effect. Deen, that which is from the spirit, can transcend that. And the Quran is all about telling us stories about the limitations of human expectations about cause and effect in the world. Look at all those stories. Who could predict materially the outcome of any of them? What really is going to happen to Sayyidina Yusuf? What really is going to be the outcome of Musa's encounter with Fir'aun? What is really going to happen to Ismail and Hajar in the desert? There's always a strange, unanticipated outcome. So that's deen, not ideology. And we need to be really clear about this, because those who are redefining the whole worldview of our civilization are reducing it to something that cannot but be totalitarian, and the result is the same unhappy result as we see with every other totalitarianism. It cannot deal with the flux and the depths of the human condition, and certainly has nothing to say to the possibility that prayer might be answered, for instance. So that's one way of beginning this journey towards trying to figure out how we can resolve the paradox of, on the one hand, sunnah, so this is how we should live, surely, true. And on the other hand, Islam's historic capacity to embrace and to colour and to transform and to purify an indefinite range of different human cultures, presumably including our own. And this is where, this might take us too far afield to discuss it, things like urf and ada are important. Pick up any pre-modern book of Islamic jurisprudence and you'll see how important and authoritative is people's own local custom. Al-ma'rufu urfan kal-mashru'i shar'an is one of the principles of the Sharia. That which is known by custom is like that which is revealed by revelation. The ideologist can't figure that out and freaks out and says, oh, this is not the sunnah, brother. But it's in all of our texts of classical fiqh, in all of the madhabs, and it's part of how our civilization dealt with this idea of sunnah, which turns out to be infinitely deeper than most of us have imagined. So maybe that's a useful problematic to try and resolve as we move through these different expressions of Islamic excellence in these different times and places that we've looked at. And if all of this, as it were, is the spectrum that comes out of the prophetic prism, the closer we get to the origins of it all, the clearer will be Islam's vision of the accommodation rather than the suppression of the natural diversity of human beings. And many of the questions that we have about God's law cannot be resolved ideologically and cannot be resolved through what you might call a fundamentalist understanding of what the early Muslims took the Sunnah to be. So, for instance, just consider if the Holy Prophet ﷺ had only married Khadija bint Khuwaylid, or just one woman in his life, and a lot of Muslims nowadays get fidgety about this, what would have been the operative consequences? Say if he'd married a woman of 30, of a particular height and build and education. All of the Muslims who love to follow the Sunnah, and they should love the Sunnah, would think, I really want a woman like that, who looks this way, who is of this height, who is of that age, who has been married, who hasn't been married, etc. And that would be an understandable form of devotion, like those Deobandi Maulanas who spend long periods of time and even books discussing what kind of buttons the Holy Prophet ﷺ had on his qamis. And that's valid in its way. It's an expression of love. But what would be the operative consequences if they also thought about who they should marry in those terms? Problematic, especially for the women. Yeah, I'm 31, no religious guy's going to marry me, I'm finished. I'll get married at 30 because that's what all the guys with beards think that they should have. It would have very significant consequences. But he marries, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, 11 or so women, and they're really different. Each one is really different. The first one is older than him, and then Aisha is much younger than him, and then there's Salama, and then there's Habiba, and they're all really different. Some of them are of Jewish origin even. And there's Rayhana, and some are from high background, some are of slave origin. That diversity has been a sign that the idea of sunnah is not meant in a restrictive sense. And there are so many other dimensions of this. And one of them, it seems to me, is this idea, and we hear it in the khutbahs, at least if you're in a Sunni mosque, عليكم بسنتي وسنة الخلفاء الراشدين من بعدي. And the Imam towards the end of the khutbah always mentions their names, Abu Bakr and Omar and Uthman and Ali, and gives a little formulaic expression of the form of perfection represented by each of them. Not which places he conquered or whatever, but what kind of person he represented. And you can see 4 different people, and their sunnah is binding. Each one represents a colour kind of pushed out from the original prophetic brightness, but each one of them really different personalities, if you think about it. What could be more different or heterogeneous than those 4 men? So already in the time of the Salaf and under current circumstances, it's important to recognise this is not something that happened with the Mughals or something, but it's in the time of the Salaf. Human diversity, big human diversity for women and for men in that early sainted generation. So he says, alayhi salatu wasalam, ashabi kan nujum bi ayyihim muqtadaytum ihtadaytum. My companions are like the stars, by whichsoever of them you guide yourself, you'll be guided. It's a nice image. If you know your night sky, there isn't a single star and you can identify it that can't actually help you to figure out where is north and where you should be going. If you're on your mule at night or something, that's how you do it before GPS. It's God's GPS, and it'll be around for long after the satellites have exploded, or it's permanent. And so they too are permanent firmament, and this is not in tension with the idea of prophetic emulation. You don't say, I could follow the Sahabi, but no, I prefer to follow the Sunnah. That's just the early version of people nowadays who are saying, oh, you're following the Shaybani, I follow the Sunnah. This kind of thing that people have in their mind. Well, you could just as well say that about people who are following the ways of Abu Bakr or Abdurrahman bin Auf or Salman al-Farisi, or one of the early great ones. So this idea of human diversity as part of the universality and inclusivity of Islam is right there, right at the beginning of the Islamic package. All of those different personalities, not by their love of the Sunnah and the Holy Prophet and their knowledge of the necessity of conforming to his perfection, homogenized ideologically as socialist man. No, you see those Russian statues from the Stalinist era, and every single one of them looks the same. You know those images sort of in usually bronze things outside some tedious party headquarters, and the guy is kind of standing like this with a torch, and then there's the dawn, and then the woman is holding a hammer, and it's that. They're always the same. Socialist man is the same kind of thing. It's scientific. And the Chinese now are doing the same thing. They call it harmonization. A Procrustean bed, if ever there was one. But no, we don't do that in Islam. We have this idea of the Sahaba, all 100,000 or whatever of them, whichever one of them. Okay, you might say it's a little bit strange if you're stuck in the desert at night and you say, I'm going to look for a particular star, Al-Qaeda, or whatever it is. There it is, I can just about see it. I'm going to steer my donkey by that. Maybe that's a slightly odd thing to do, but it'll still get you to your destination. And that's why we say Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. They're not all the same. That is impossible in terms of the eminence. As-Sabiqun al-Awwalun, al-Ashra Mubashara. These great ones are not the same as somebody who converts 3 days before the Holy Prophet's death and doesn't do much. Obviously, it's not ideological. It recognizes human diversity, but in a way that does not ever compromise the all-important Sunni principle of the Sunnah And we really need to understand this, because a lot of our mutual blaming and anxiety amongst Muslims is based on the fact that we differ. You know, you have a lot of Pakistanis don't understand Islam, and the Saudis are like this. Difference, diversity, is the way Allah has made us. اختلاف ألسنتكم وألوانكم is of His signs, the difference of your languages and colours. And ideology is not into that. It's too scientific. There has to be one proper Chinese citizen. But Deen doesn't do that, and that's one reason why ideologies always crash in humiliation. Deen keeps going. So the four khulafa, we could say that's one example. You could talk about the wives of the Holy Prophet and the different types of female perfection, and each of them is an incredible woman, but they're different. But we're going to talk today about one of the khulafa, just to indicate something that again makes us think about what we're doing when we think of paradigms of leadership. It's not one paradigm of leadership, just be like the Holy Prophet and be identical to that. No, you know the Greek story of the Procrustean bed, the ancient king of Greece who had a bed and he invited his guests to stay on it every night. And if they were too long, he'd cut off their feet. If they were too short, he'd have them stretched. So it's become an English kind of proverb, the Procrustean bread, that which tries to fit everything into a single template, which is what the Marxists tried to do, but with the diversity and difficulty of humankind, didn't really work. People still wanted to have their businesses and to do their own thing, and it didn't fit the reality of humanity. But Islam says, Ahlan sahlan, welcome, and you can be as long or short as you like, and you're still welcome. And it's important for us in our anxious and defensive age not to retreat into ideology, but to continue this generous affirmation of difference, which is there in Al-Khulafa Al-Rashideen Al-Mahdiyina min Ba'di. That's part of the Sunnah. So the one I want to talk about is actually Uthman bin Affan, radiyallahu an. Maybe the one that we think about and hear about least. So I'm going to do a bit of biodata. Some of it will be familiar anyway, but also a bit of kind of analysis, what sort of model of Sunnah perfection. So you follow him and emulate him according to the Holy Prophet himself. That's following the Sunnah. That's a big thing. It's not prophecy, but it's kind of in the shape of prophecy. Well, to go through the biodata first, always essential to see people as consequences of their time and place, as well as people who, certainly in his case, shook and changed the world in their time and place. He is the almost exact, precise contemporary of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. What does that mean exactly? I mean, just last Thursday happened to be the 40th anniversary of my taking Shahada. Does that? Should I have a party or I don't know. But it's something to think about. So he is born 5 days after the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which is of course Am al-Fil, the year of the elephant. So a close contemporary, and is also, of course, Qurayshi and his aristocratic, blue-blooded. Uthman ibn Affan ibn Abil As ibn Umayyah ibn Abd Shams ibn Abd Manaf. Mother, Arwa, an aristocrat of Quraysh. Her mother, Hakim bint Abdul Muttalib ibn Hashim, the twin sister of the Holy Prophet's father, so really kind of close in kinship. He's one of the first converts to Islam, and the scholars say maybe the fifth. He is converting during Abu Bakr's very secret early da'wah when things are really ominous. It's like talking about something other than state ideology in Albania. La ilaha illallah. Still places like that today. And that's how it was in the days of the secret persecution. So Ibn Ishaq says that first of the male convert Abu Bakr, then Ali, then Zayd bin Haritha, and then Uthman bin Affan. And that's the earliest Sirah book, and most of the later historians say, so that's really sabaq, precedence in Islam, which is one of the ways in which we kind of rank the Sahaba, the people of Badr, and the people who are the Muhajirun, and then the Ansar. It's different gradations of the Sahaba, although of course it's not always an immediate indication of who should do what, because again, we're not looking at ideology. Remember there's, I think it was Himmler or somebody who had party member number 8 or something. He had a little badge saying this, and for them to be one of the first Nazis was a big deal, but that was just kind of ego. It didn't mean anything. But the longer you're with God's Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the more of his tribulations that you share with him, that obviously is a sign that you are trustworthy. So he is a big name convert, and of course this throws the cat amongst the pigeons, and his uncle, Al-Hakim ibn Abil As, kind of goes up to him and physically grabs him, starts shaking him and shouting at him, and then takes him off and ties him to a post in a public place and saying, "Are you going to leave the religion of your ancestors, the deen of your ancestors?" He should have said ideology, I guess, because they were to comply or else. By Allah, I will not leave you until you give this up. But Uthman says, Wallahi ma taraktu ma ana fihi abada. Uthman takes an oath and swears, by Allah, I will never leave this, ever. And eventually, after a lot more shaking, the uncle kind of gives up. And a lot of converts have this experience that, you become a terrorist, you're going to hang out with weird people, you're going to be sold into slavery in Sudan or something, the usual kind of parental freak out that convert parents sometimes experience. But eventually, when you're strong, they kind of reconfigure it, and you give them some flowers and chocolates and remember their birthdays for a change, and it kind of settles down. And this is constant. It's a constant of human nature. People don't want to be isolated from their own flesh and blood. السابقون الأولون, Quranic phrase, the first predecessors in Islam. Some would identify with these who were Muslim at the time of the first migration to Al-Habasha, Ethiopia, or who actually participated in it. So he goes, and already he has the Holy Prophet's daughter Ruqayya as his spouse, and together they go to Al-Habasha. And so the Holy Prophet's, one of the first prayers that is recorded of him that he makes for Uthman is Uthmanu awwalu man hajara ma'a ahlihi. Uthman is the first to have made hijrah with his family, and it's said that he was the first to have done this since the time of Sayyidina Lut alayhi salam. This is recorded in the hadith collection. So he's taking his family with him, and in Ethiopia they're a sort of sensation, because one of the things that is narrated of him is that he was of very extreme physical beauty. And at this time, it's kind of his early 40s, in his prime, magnificent. And also, Ruqayya, his wife, is stunningly beautiful. And this is one of the reasons, it seems, why the Najashi and his entourage kind of melted. And from that time, it's actually been a principle of Sharia that you should never appoint as an ambassador anybody who really isn't good to look at. I don't know if the Foreign Office have the same principle, but I don't know, maybe they'll appoint somebody who's lost an eye and kind of has no teeth to be Her Majesty's representative to Abu Dhabi or Gambia or somewhere, but it's just good psychology that if you're pleading a case, you kind of look magnificent, because human beings naturally are inclined to beauty. So they were kind of radiant and luminous. And one of the Sahaba says, رأيت عثمان بن عفان وما رأيت رجلا ولا امرأة أجمل منه وجها. I saw, he's reminiscing, Uthman bin Affan, and never in my life have I seen a man or even a woman whose face was more beautiful than his. So he was really a sensation, and this is one of the things that is recalled of him. Usama bin Zayd narrates, the messenger once sent me to Uthman's house with a plate of food, so I go in, وَإِذَا بِرُقَيَّةٍ رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنْهَا جَالِسَةٍ فشرعت أنظر إلى وجه رقية تارة وإلى وجه عثمان. I went in and there was Ruqayya, Allah be pleased with her, sitting down, and then I couldn't stop looking at Uthman and at her and at Uthman and at her. And when I returned, the messenger said, have you ever seen a more beautiful couple than they? And I said, La ya Rasulullah, never. So pretty dazzling. There's also a range of hadiths in which the Holy Prophet comments on a resemblance between Uthman and Hazrat Ibrahim alayhi salam. This comes up in a number of hadiths. And what are we to make of this? Is it a physical resemblance or some kind of spiritual resemblance? But he often says that he found this tashabuh, this resemblance. And it may well be that this has something to do with what is Uthman's most famous quality or characteristic. The khatib is on the minbar and he's finishing his khutbah and he says, وَأَصْدَقُهُمْ حَيَاءً Uthman. And all of the people who can't understand Arabic say, Ameen, Ameen, although the dua has finished, but it's just praising Uthman, but never mind. It's a prayer that's already come about. And the one who is most sincere in modesty is Uthman. That's what we say of the third of the four khilafas. And what are we to understand by this modesty? And this is maybe the heart of what we want to get at today. If we're looking at the very earliest Muslims, those who are Sunnah themselves, still illuminated by the memory of the Sahib al-Risala alayhi salatu wassalam, each of them having a different form of human perfection that is to do with inheritance, DNA, upbringing, whatever. We're all different. Ideology tries to squeeze us onto that Procrustean bed. Deen says, let's see what Allah has made of you and see how you can be perfect and represent the Sunnah in a perfect form according to what you are made to be. So, أصدقهم حياء Uthman. This idea of haya seems to conflict completely with our conventional view of what leadership might be. Haya is kind of like being modest. There's sound hadiths in which it was reported that Uthman, even when in the kind of shower cubicle, would be like that and wouldn't stand up. So it can naturally hayi, a modest person. What kind of leader is that? Is not like Prince Andrew or Boris or Trump or these people who are now seen as symbols of immodesty. The darkest secrets of what you once did, you kind of blab about it in front of a camera. This is not the Islamic way. And the Holy Prophet says, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, لِكُلِّ دِينٍ خُلُقٍ وَخُلُقُ الْإِسْلَامِ الْحَيَاءُ. Every religion has a particular virtue that characterizes it, the spiritual type that it favors, and that of Islam is haya. So that's the essence of the Islamic modality of being, but how do we even translate it? It's so specific to Islam. It's another of those kind of untranslatable things like sunnah. It's so Islamic that we don't have a word in English. Precedent, no. Won't, no. Sunnah is just sunnah. Haya, sometimes we translate it as humility or modesty or shyness. That's kind of a bit of it. But how does that become a paradigm of leadership? How do you do that and still be a shepherd responsible for all of the Muslims in these armies that by this time are in Central Asia and North Africa? That's another very characteristic Islamic paradox, but it's again part of the prophetic sunnah, the prophetic perfection. كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أشد حياء من البكر في خدرها. The Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was more modest, more shy than a virgin in her tent. Whoa, this is a man with the red turban and the scimitar who's unifying his people, the hero, the warrior, but more modest, more shy than the virgin in her tent, which is kind of for the Arabs' essence. That again is something that you have to work out if you're going to understand what Islam means by its specific form of virtue. It's not the chest-beating warrior from Game of Thrones with whatever. It's not that. It's some other model of warrior excellence that to us seems very strange. Who is the person who is at the forefront of things, who is the shyest of people? This, in our age of democratic politics, when everybody is there because they want to be there, and modesty, hayat wouldn't get you very far on the slippery pole of politics nowadays, because it's all about our CVs. You can't get a job unless you boast and tell half-truths. I'm a very dynamic, outgoing person and a team player, and I've done... Islam says, cross it all out. It's a problem for us. But this is, the khuluq al-Islam, the Holy Prophet says it, and it's a sound hadith. And how can we be shyer than the virgin in her tent and get anything done, even argue with the plumber? Shy, it's and one of these interesting paradoxes. But it's a prophetic quality, and it's characteristic of so much of Muslim social existence. Modesty, with the religion of hijab, the religion of niqab, the religion of no seclusion, all of that. Other religions recognize the virtue of modesty, obviously. Immodesty is not appreciated by anybody if they're serious. But we really do these things. It's khuluq al-Islam, characteristic of, look at any group of Muslims and see who sits next to whom. And on a bus in Turkey now, if there's only one place on the bus and the woman gets on, and there's a man who would have sat next to her, he gets up and sits next to a man, and the woman who was there goes and it's his wife, and they rearrange it so that she doesn't have to sit next to a strange man. In the Muslim world, these things are understood. And this is important because we're often kind of dismissed for this, as if we're inhibited or buttoned up or puritanical, and that's not the Muslim way either. Our hayat coexists with a naturalness about every aspect of humanity, including marriage. So it's a modesty that is not an inhibition. And this, in the context of recent news, is kind of important. Because what is the only thing modernity can say about the male-female relation? They're equal. Equality. Liberation is equality. The man and the woman are equal. Now, when some 20-year-old aspiring actress goes to see Harvey Weinstein in his suite at the Waldorf Astoria in New York, and she's alone and he's there, you can say they're equal. Yes. Okay, we can say they're equal, of course, created to be equal. But that is not an adequate account of that situation. It's not enough just to say they're equal, which is what the feminists will kind of want to do. Islam will say, well, no khalwa, no illicit seclusion. The hadith says the shaitan is the third of them. And it will also say, where's her mahram? Her brother should be there, kind of obvious, or her father. But the feminist thing doesn't like that. Equality, of course she can be there. The reality of our messy world excludes any kind of idealistic image of what equality might mean. There are certain realities where modesty is usually in the woman's interest. Usually a society where modesty is respected is one that protects women better than one where people are just predators. Because something in the male temperament, man is either a predator or a protector. We're raptors, basically, and it's not necessarily something to be proud of particularly, but the Sharia says, these boundaries. Don't go to his hotel room. Don't go to the island in the Caribbean on the private jet and all of these things. It's not really a very complicated concept to understand. And it's always the women who get hurt in these situations because they end up with the baby or feeling psychologically damaged or trafficked or whatever. If you just say equality, you're not dealing with the reality of the fact that he's stronger, he's a bully, she's the one who's going to get pregnant, he won't. Equality doesn't quite do it. So this idea of hijab and of reserve between the genders is not really what the feminists like, but it certainly 9 times out of 10 will serve the interests of the female rather than the male. She's on a long-distance bus in Turkey. Does she really want to go to sleep when there's a guy she doesn't know next to her? No. So equality, fine, has to be something else as well. And this hayat, this modesty, which is very much the Islamic ethos, is important. And all of these modernist Muslims who want to be accepted or feel embarrassed by these kind of old customs and say, well, it doesn't really matter and we can just mingle freely and it's cool to socialize. And, well, when they become victims, or when the girls become victims, which is the more usual case in the cruel inequalities of the real world, then they might think, oh, well, it didn't work too well that time, did it? But then they end up, this is, half of our headlines are about what happens when you don't have modesty. So this is the quality of Sayyidina Uthman. And we have to get our heads around the fact that when he becomes Khalifa, the Muslim thing is already enormous. It's the big new superpower in the world. And this man who is so hayy, modest, is in charge of it. So that indicates the radicalness of the human person generated by absence of ego. And we've seen this many times on this journey with these paradigms of leadership, that somebody who really doesn't have ego is really different and strange, doesn't care. You clean the toilet for somebody and it doesn't matter, doesn't even think about it afterwards. And that's different, not just to be committed to the poor, like Karl Marx, but to live with the poor. He kind of lived a relatively comfortable life in Hampstead or wherever it was, even though his wife said after he died, I wish Karl had spent less time writing about capital and more time earning some. But yes, it's human nature. But the Holy Prophet ﷺ prays to be resurrected amongst the Masakin. That's where he'll be, not with us kind of fortunate, centrally heated Westerners with our nice cars, but with the kind of barefoot Rohingya or whoever is there. That's where to find him, and that's a different kind of leadership. It's moving, troubling, guilt-inducing, but that's religion turns everything upside down, not through some kind of class war, but through something much deeper, which is inverting people's priorities. Be with the poor, love the poor. The Holy Prophet ﷺ wouldn't go to sleep at night if there was a coin in his house. That's radical. Nowadays that's an empty bank balance. That's the letter from the bailiffs. That's that world, the precariat. That's where the divine favour is likely to be. So all of these figures represent the real revolution, which is the revolution in the human heart, which is what a new religion brings. So we find he's wealthy, he's aristocratic, and he doesn't care. It's like Imam al-Junayd's statement that zuhud, asceticism, doing without, is for the heart to be empty of what the hand is empty of. If you're poor, but you really wish you had stuff, that's not zuhud. Zuhud, which is the quality of all of the prophets, is really not to care. Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, if there was food, he'd eat it. If there wasn't, he'd go to sleep hungry, and it wasn't what he was thinking about. It doesn't become an issue. So that again is kind of radical when you think about it. Not just not to mind being poor and putting up with it, but kind of not noticing it not being an issue. So, عن الحسن قال رأيت عثمان نائما في المسجد في ملحفة ليس حوله أحد وهو أمير المؤمنين. Al-Hasan, this is one of Imam Ali's sons, said, I once saw Uthman sleeping alone in the mosque with a rough blanket over him, and he was Amir al-Mu'mineen. Wow. If you've dealt with sort of rich visitors on CMC tours, for instance, it was really not acceptable. Air conditioning in my room last night, it was so noisy, and what is this CMC, and why did you put me in this hotel with the noisy air conditioner? And really sorry. Please don't stop giving us your £1,000 a year or whatever. Really sorry about the air conditioner. Uthman is not even thinking about how he should be. He's one of the most powerful people in the world already, leading these unstoppable armies. He just crashes out in the mosque with a blanket and isn't even at the beginning of an issue for him. So that's part of what we are looking at. And in his own environment, he's wealthy, continues to be wealthy. He's one of the richest of the Sahaba. عن شرحبيل قال إن عثمان كان يطعم الناس طعام الإمارة ويدخل بيته فيأكل الخل والزيت. Uthman used to feed people the way a prince feeds people, and then he'd go to his house and there would be vinegar and olives. That's just how he was. And again, he probably wouldn't even think about that. That was just not his concern. He used to ride around Medina, but not on a kind of smart white horse, but on a mule. And if he had his servant or secretary, he'd be kind of riding behind him on the mule, and it might not look so regal, but it's not exactly the coronation coach going down the mall, is it, to back in all of the trumpets and the fanfares. That stuff is fine, but these people are different. He's happy with the mule and the secretary behind him. Different. One aspect of his haya, of his modesty, which is why modesty is not really a very good translation, is he was very soft-hearted. كان إذا وقف على قبر بكى. If he stood to pray at a grave, he would weep until his beard became wet. Kind of soft-hearted, remembering mortality. رأيت عثمان بن عفان يوم الجمعة على المنبر عليه إزار عدني غليظ ثمنه 4 دراهم أو 5 دراهم وريتة خوفية ممشقة. Somebody said, I once saw Uthman bin Affan on Friday. He was on the minbar giving the khutbah. Now and there are legitimate arguments for this, say, the Quran says, خُذُوا زِينَتَكُمْ عِنْدَ كُلِّ مَسْجِدٍ. Be beautiful in every masjid, and that's part of respect for the mosque and for the what's going on there. But Uthman, radiallahu anh, wasn't part of the world of the huge turban and the kaftan and the performance that we have, even though that becomes how it should be, because people naturally are going to respect the dignity of the person up there. You can see the majesty of our civilization there. If he's just in jeans and a t-shirt and kind of standing any old how and his phone is going off and he's just an ordinary bloke, you don't respect the word so much. And this is recognized. You want to see the solar, the majesty of the ulama there, and this is appropriate. But back in those days, I once saw Uthman on Friday on the minbar, and he had a rough loincloth from Aden, which might have been worth 4 or 5 coins, and then a torn kind of shirt which was on him. This is part of the diversity. This is also part of prophetic perfection, poverty and being clean, but not extravagant. And this is what religion brings that is new, because it's not the Byzantine emperor, and it's not the king of Persia, and it's not the emperor of China, where everything is kind of operatic in its magnificence. He was not even thinking about whether he should do that or not, but he just got up to give the khutbah, and it was probably so amazing. The people were in tears, and the paraphernalia wouldn't matter. Another aspect of his, shall we say, aristocratic virtues is his generosity. This is one of the things that is most remembered for. And this, again, is an aspect of prophetic perfection. وَلَا رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ أَسْرَعُ بِالْخَيْرِ مِنَ الرِّيحِ الْمُرْسَلَةِ. The Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was quicker in giving than the winds which just come and go. The imagery being that it's kind of unpredictable and spontaneous. It's just like a force of nature. You just give. You don't think, maybe next March I will give sadaqah, and I think I can afford £120 and such a charity, and I'll note it in my diary, and I'll get a email reminder. And it's not like that. It's seeing the need, and immediately here you are. And it's like the wind. It's a nice image, and that was the prophetic way. Sayyidina Uthman radiallahu an was the same, and was famous for a number of key benefactions in the history of the Ummah in Medina when they came, and some of the tribes were not allowing them access to water, and so he paid for a well to be dug, which is the famous Bi'r Ruma, which is still there, and I've been there, and it's actually still, I don't know, somebody hasn't noticed it in Riyadh, but it's still a beautiful place with the palm trees and the water, and it's delicious water. Each of the wells of Medina is traditionally believed to have a different taste, and the Ottoman elite, one of the things they would do would be to have a kind of water evening, and they would sample water from different parts of the world, and kind of, it was like wine tasting or something, but probably ended rather better. And Bi'r Ruma was famous, and it's still, my kids said, it's a very sacred place. He was the one who dug it, which was a big operation in those days before big yellow machines and knowing where to do it and how to. So that was one of the things for which the Holy Prophet asked for Allah's blessings that he spent for that. And the other was the Battle of Tabuk, or the expedition of Tabuk. أنه جهز جيش العسرة. This is called the army of difficulty, because the army had to go in the summer, and people had just suffered the siege and the campaigns, and they were impoverished. They found it difficult, and Uthman bin Affan made it possible by equipping 1,000 cavalry. So let's listen to this and see if we can find a contemporary resonance for this expression of leadership. خطب رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فحث على جيش العسرة فقال عثمان على 100 بعير بأحلاسها وأقتابها. The Holy Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم gave an address and urged people to participate in the army of difficulty. And Uthman said, I will contribute 100 camels with all of their saddles and accoutrements and reins. قال ثم حث. And the Holy Prophet again urged people. فقال عثمان على 100 أخرى بأحلاسها. And Uthman stands up again and said, another 100 with its equipment. قال ثم حث فقال عثمان على 100 أخرى بأحلاسها وأقتابها. And so it goes on. فرأيت النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول ما على عثمان من ما عمل بعد هذا. And then the narrator said, after all of this, I saw the Holy Prophet saying and moving his hand in some way, whatever Uthman does after this is going to be sort of covered by this. This is an amazing sadaqah that he's giving. Now it's interesting that what we see here is a little bit similar to what we get sometimes with Muslim fundraising today. And we think, oh dear, this is like some kind of, I don't know, The Voice or something. There's a presenter and he's getting us worked up and this is nothing to do with Islam. But this is what is happening. It's a kind of ancient thing. The Holy Prophet is urging them. I pledge 100 camels, Ya Rasulullah. But he does it 3 times. And the result is that the army is equipped in that world where the empires and the tribes were out to annihilate the early Muslims in the city of Medina. So the making of pledges, as long as, of course, as you fulfill the pledges, rather than, as has happened to the new mosque project, having to deal with checks that bounce and that kind of thing. If you actually do it with sidq, it's a prophetic emulation. رأى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم عثمان بن عفان يوم جيش العسرة جائيا وذاهبا فقال اللهم اغفر لي عثمان ما أقبل وأدبر وما أخفى وما أعلن وما أسر وما أجهر. Holy Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم saw Uthman coming and going and rushing about trying to equip this army, and he prayed, "O Allah, forgive Uthman that which he has turned to and turned away from, that which he hides and what he has announced, that which he has not spoken about and that which he has spoken about." So we have this combination of this kind of physical beauty, aristocratic graciousness, noblesse oblige, a complete indifference to how comfortable he was himself, the traditional hospitality and generosity of the well-trained nobleman, and also this kind of modesty, this haya. Ashaddu ummati haya'an Uthman ibn Affan. The one in my ummah who has the most haya is Uthman ibn Affan. But there's other things. One of the things that kind of made the biggest difference historically was his relationship to the Quran. He is said to have been in all of Islamic history one of only 2 Khalifas who was Hafiz, memorized the whole Quran. The other was Al-Ma'mun, the Abbasid Caliph, who was Hafiz. So he was somebody who preserved Allah's book by heart and was involved during his Khilafah with making sure that the text that was known by the Sahaba who heard the Holy Prophet recite it fully, and they knew the text, was preserved in some kind of written form that could then be sent out in order to be compared against various variations that were inevitably happening in faraway places. So he assembles a committee in order to make sure that there's a kind of authorized version, if you like, which is the Uthmanic recension. And there's books now which claim to be that Quran, and it's really hard to determine their exact age because they've been through obviously 1400 years of historic vicissitudes. But if you go to Tashkent, ancient Shash, capital of Uzbekistan, and you go to the Moye Mubarak Madrasa, which is a madrasa which has a hair from the beard of the Holy Prophet, it's called Moye Mubarak. Next to it they have a kind of museum of the Quran where they have what they say is the original Quran that Hazrat Uthman was reciting during his martyrdom. So they'll point out the stains on the page that they say are his blood. There's other copies of this. They say there's one in Egypt. Allahu A'lam. But his relationship to the Quran is something that the Ummah has certainly preserved in its memory. His titles also indicative of the kind of leader that he was. He's often known as Dhun Norain, the man of the two lights. Maybe this is the most common of his epithets, Dhu and Norain. Sometimes if you see in some ceremonial mosques in parts of the Islamic world, very self-consciously Sunni, they'll have the names of the four Khalifas, and they might have in smaller characters the particular quality of that Khalifa. So he's Dhun Norain, the one with the two lights. What are the two lights? Well, there's one net text that indicates that this is to do with two particular forms of divine proximity that he will be granted in paradise. There will be two flashes of light that accompany him in the garden, and there's early texts that indicate that. But the more usual interpretation in the Ummah is that he was the only person who ever married two of the daughters of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Ruqayya, as we saw, who dies more or less during the Battle of Badr, although she's in Medina, and then Kulthum later on. So the one who has two prophetic spouses, the man of two lights, and according to a narration from Imam Ali, it was the Holy Prophet who gave him this title specifically. So Ruqayya is the mother of his son Abdullah ibn Uthman. So he has his kunya, his patronymic, Abu Abdillah is his kind of informal name. And he is in, because his daughter is kind of dying, so he has permission not to go and join the Battle of Badr, obviously. And he buries her as the news reaches Medina of the victory of Badr. And because he receives some of the ghanaim, some of the booty of Badr, he's sometimes in some of the lists included as one of those who were of the people of Badr. And then he marries Kulthum, who also leaves him bereaved because she dies in the year 9 of the Hijrah. And the Holy Prophet says in the hadith, if I had a third unmarried daughter, I would give her to Uthman as well, and I marry my daughters only with wahi, with revelation. And this is another indication of an aspect of prophetic emulation, which is that you make sure that you marry your daughters to somebody who will honour them. Uthman certainly honoured the daughters of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And in this, perhaps we can again go back to the idea of modesty and the idea also of respect and how we deal with these endless human sort of train crashes that's now afflicted the royal family, and Boris Johnson with his girlfriend in Downing Street, but he's still got his wife somewhere else, and it's at a event arranged by some Muslims recently to which Boris Johnson was invited. The idea was that he would be sat next to a woman in niqab, because he makes these comments about letterboxes. So that would be interesting. And then during the event, he would slowly realise it's actually his wife. So that's one way of getting onto the front page of the Daily Mail, but it didn't happen that way. But the point is, this is Eros, the Greeks said, was the god that never is defeated. You defeat him one way, he gets you some other way. And that's one reason why in our time, where everything is kind of immodest and the internet is full of freakish, outrageous immodesty, the religion that's been given for this time is the religion of really strict modesty and correct comportment, and people being very careful about what they say, because the ulama say that impropriety in that area of human life is more destructive than anything else. It really does very deep damage. So the Holy Prophet ﷺ is obviously choosing men for his daughters, huge responsibility, and this is part of being a shepherd, and gives his daughter not to somebody who's going to have a kind of luxury lifestyle, because he certainly doesn't, but this person who is profoundly decent. And that's a major responsibility for Muslim parents, always. Never mind status, prestige, etc., but somebody decent. And a footnote to this is that so much of the language about Islam and modernity focuses on Sharia disparities. let's get rid of polygamy and let's change those inheritance laws, blah, blah, until everything is gone, really, that isn't just what the West wants. And there's a lot of that chit-chat in the Muslim world as in the West. But actually the real issue, as we see with these people, is not really Sharia disparities, but rather how decently people treat each other. You can have a system that's perfectly egalitarian and irons out any wrinkles, but if people are still unrefined and they're still predators and they're still not compassionate and they still don't have respect, it's going to be a disaster and relationships won't last. You look at the divorce rate and relationships breaking up in modern England, even though they've ironed out any kind of disparity between husband and wife decades ago, but still it's not working. So if we want to set our communities right, which is evidently what we should, because we're dysfunctional very often in this area, sometimes our relationships don't work, just saying, oh, let's have a new ijtihad about inheritance law or something isn't really the most useful place to look, but instead, how can we get people to behave better to each other and with more respect? So it's a kind of inward, akhlaqi, Sufi thing rather than a fiqhi thing. You can't actually change people's behaviour through acts of parliament. You can punish them for being bad, but making them not bad in the first place is more interesting and is really the essence of religion. So the idea of the spouse as shahid, as a Sufi rather than a fiqhi category. Karramna bani Adam, we have ennobled the descendants of Adam. And Hawa and Adam were the summit of creation, and that which was given to Adam was nothing short of the perfection that everything in the garden partook of. That hemisphere has to be seen as a sign of divine creativity and greatness and needs to be treated with respect, not just with equal rights. Respect and honouring and amazement and gratitude has to be the basis of the relationship, the male-female relationship in any culture. Law is, you have to have good laws. That's not really going to reach far enough into the human heart to make relationships really work. So there has to be hayat, modesty. Don't lord it over him or her or just press for this or that, but just be grateful and respectful and amazed. And the blessings will come. And this is kind of obvious, but nowadays we're so keen on box ticking, and we often have swanky weddings, and a few years later it all kind of comes to nothing, and people tend not to recover fully from that. The hadith says, "At-talaqu yahtazzu lahu arsh ar-Rahman." Divorce shakes the throne of the Rahman. It's abghadul halal, the most detested of all permissible things. So we need to go into those relationships, which should be easy. The two hemispheres, it's the fitrah, what could be more obvious, on the basis of respect for Allah's creation and the indicativity of gender, rather than just what's in it for me and is this an acquisition and does she go along with me and agree with me and all of that kind of nafs talk. So the decline of the inner akhlaqi Sufi dimension of Islam has actually made the fiqh much harder work, because we're always looking at these books of talaq and things, and counselling and relationships. And that's just kind of an emergency escape hatch, a very occasional thing, rather than something that half of the population should be looking towards. So Holy Prophet ﷺ looks carefully to where he places his family members, his DNA. This is vitally important, and chooses somebody who's not going to worry about the noisy air conditioner, but is a fundamentally decent, respectful human being. He's also known as one of the Sahaba who were most kind of emphatic in their ibadah. So if you look at the tafsir works where it says, أَمَنْ هُوَ قَانِتٌ آنَاءَ اللَّيْلِ سَاجِدًا وَقَائِمًا يَحْذُرُ الْآخِرَةَ وَيَرْجُو رَحْمَةَ رَبِّهِ, is he who is humbly standing for the stretches of the night, prostrate and upright, fearing the next world and hoping for the mercy of his Lord, the tafsir authors say, on the authority of Ibn Omar, Huwa Uthman ibn Affan, is Uthman ibn Affan. And elsewhere in the books of tafsir, where it says, الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ ثُمَّ اتَّقَوْا وَآمَنُوا ثُمَّ اتَّقَوْا وَأَحْسَنُوا وَاللَّهُ يُحِبُّ الْمُحْسِنِينَ. Those who have iman and do beautiful works and then fear Allah and then have iman and then fear Allah and then have ihsan, Allah loves those who have ihsan. Very interesting verse. Imam Ali says that's also related specifically in connection with Uthman bin Affan. So كان عثمان رضي الله عنه يصوم الدهر وَيَقُومُ اللَّيْلِ إِلَّا هَجْأَةً مِنْ أَوَّلِهِ. Uthman used to fast continuously and pray every night except for a small rest that he'd take at the beginning of the night. And it's recorded by the historians that somebody once watched him in the mosque in Medina to see what is he doing exactly. And it turned out that he was reciting the entire Quran in 2 rak'ahs. Even today you hear stories of people doing that. You recite it clearly but rapidly, and you can do that. It might take 7 or 8 hours. It's possible. But this is one of the things that he was known to have done. During the sad story of his martyrdom, when the streets were full of uncouth rioters trying to break down his door, his wife leant over from the parapet and said, إن تقتلوه أو تتركوه فإنه كان يحيي الليل كله في ركعة يجمع فيها القرآن. His wife is saying, whether you kill him or let him live, he'll still be the man who recited the entire Quran in 1 rak'ah. She knew. She lived with him. He said, that's my husband. So what are you doing? Famous for fiqh as well. Particularly some of the hadith that have come down to us and the early sayings and positions of the tabi'een about the Hajj are narrated specifically on the authority of Uthman ibn Affan. So again, there's a lot to be said about him. He was perhaps the closest counselor to Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anh during his 2 years khilafah, which were 2 very turbulent years. Also, according to some of the historians, like Baladhuri, the closest counselor to Hazrat Omar radiallahu anh during his khilafah, very involved. So, for instance, one of the issues that arose, these places are being conquered. What do you do with the lands? So the big Byzantine, because it's a feudal system in the Byzantine Empire, and the Dehqans, the big landowners of Persia, they kind of fled or were slain on the field of battle. What do you do with the lands? And some of the conquerors were saying, we want them. And Omar consults with Uthman, who says, no, they should be returned to their original owners. That, of course, has a very big sort of impact on the demography and the balance of wealth in the early Islamic empire, and it's irrespective of whether they're Muslim or not. So the Greek owners, the Armenians and so forth, the Copts, if they're still there, they get their estates back. So Omar accepts this view. Another of the, so much that could be said on this, things that when we think about leadership in Islam remind us that it is pluriform, diverse, and again a reminder that that is necessary if the Sunnah is not to turn into ideology, is the fact that these Khulafa, Rashideen, Mahdiyin, rightly guided caliphs, the process by which each of them becomes caliph is very different. That's important for us as an ummah. If there was a verse in the Quran saying a ruler must come to power through X, Y, Z, inheritance, he's the eldest son, or he takes power, or whoever's in charge, or whatever, that would be binding upon us. Now, you'd have ideology. But in fact, by divine providence, the process by which each of these 4 early caliphs comes to be Amir al-Mu'mineen is quite different. So it's by acclamation, the complex, difficult times, the Saqifa of Bani Sa'ida, and eventually a kind of consensus and a very rowdy gathering at the Saqifa of the Bani Sa'ida, that Abu Bakr becomes Khalifa. And then he designates his successor. By Nas, it's going to be Omar, and that's accepted. And then Omar dies, of course, suddenly assassinated. Things are not, it's not expected. What's going to happen now? Now, in the context of the ancient world, there was really only one way in which you could get to be ruler, which was being born into it. That was the Egyptian model, all of those dynasties. That was the Byzantine model. That was the Persian model, China. They all had dynasties. And the word dawla originally meant dynasty. It was the eldest son. And of course in Europe and in England it's the same. It's by primogeniture. Now, in early Islam, there were lots of people who thought, well, that has to be the case for us. But ما كان محمد أبا أحد من رجالكم. Muhammad, as the Quran says, is not the father of any of your men. And his daughters, apart from Hazrati Fatima, who's already ill, have predeceased him. So a kind of imperial idea of primogeniture is not going to be easily applied. But in any case, there's nothing in the Quran or the Sunnah that indicates that that's how it should be. The same Quran and Sunnah that's so detailed about so many other aspects of life, and the book of Wudu is this big, how you get to be Amir al-Mu'mineen, something that's worked out consensually through disputation and trial and error in subsequent generations and centuries of fiqh discussion, but it's not really part of the original thing. So ideology, which is always very politically obsessed, can't really get a handle on this because it's diverse. Each of these four rulers is coming to power through a different process. So how does Uthman express this? How does he begin his temporal leadership? Omar, before he dies, appoints a committee of 6 men who are going to have this discussion in consultation, shura, with the rest of the Muslims. Now, of course, you can't consult people who are in Qayrawan and Kufa and places because it takes 3 months to get there, and it's not going to work. So it's Medina, and Medina, as we saw with our Imam Malik lecture, has a particular paradigmatic representative value. It's a kind of ummah in microcosm. So these 6 men who are chosen by Omar are Ali ibn Abi Talib, Uthman bin Affan, and Abdurrahman bin Auf, who is somebody who ends up unwillingly really chairing this committee, who again is one of the Sabiqun Awwalun. They say he was the 8th convert to Islam and was the one who rallied the troops at Uhud when it looked as if all was lost, and he's the one who shouted and ended up defending the Holy Prophet with a small band of faithful warriors. A person of immense distinction, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, Zubair, Talha ibn Ubaidillah. These are the kind of inner core who have been around from the earliest times, and Omar knows they have only the interests of Islam at heart. So Uthman is on that committee. And they have 3 days, and the decision has to be on the 4th day. It's not like choosing the Pope, where you get all of these old guys from Bolivia or wherever, and they sit together. Supposedly they have their discussions in Latin, but I don't know if it's quite like that. And they're not allowed out until they've chosen a pope, and there's camp beds, and they bring in pizzas and things, and they have to decide who's the pope. And then the white, you know, the whole drama, the operatic aspect of that. Well, these people are given 3 days, despite the trauma. Sayyidina Omar would have sorted this out, but he's been stabbed. Abdurrahman bin Auf chairs the committee, but says he will not stand. He will not become the Khalifa. لست بالذي أنافسكم على هذا الأمر. He says, I'm not going to compete with you in this matter. But he presides, so he asks each of them in turn, would you do it? Starting with Imam Ali, who's the Holy Prophet's cousin, son-in-law. Ali does not speak. Az-Zubayr says it has to be either Ali or Uthman. Uthman says it should be Ali. Sa'd says Uthman. Majority kind of in favour of Uthman, because remember he's been the kind of prime minister or the deputy for Abu Bakr and for Omar, and was trusted with two of the daughters of the Holy Prophet, Dhul Nurayn, etc. And I didn't mention the other titles. Dhul Qiblatain, he prays towards the two Qiblas. Dhul Hijratain, he participates in the two Hijras. He has a lot of these kind of dual titles. So a person of real distinction. And then they go out to sound out the people in Medina, and the consensus seems to be in favour of Uthman. The fourth day comes, they have to have a decision. Abdurrahman bin Auf goes out for Fajr, prays in the mosque, and it must have been a pretty intense prayer. فَلَمَّا صَلُّوا الصُّبْحَ اجْتَمَعُوا وأرسل عبد الرحمن إلى من حضر من المهاجرين والأنصار وأمراء الأجناد ثم خطبهم. So after the prayer, Abdurrahman bin Auf asks people to stay, and then he sends out messages to the heads of the tribes and the Muhajirin and the Ansar and the military leaders, and then he stands up and speaks to them. فحمد الله وأثنى عليه ثم قال أما بعد فإني نظرت في أمر الناس وشاورتهم فلم أجدهم يعدلون بعثمان ثم قال يا عثمان نبايعك على سنة رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم والخليفتين من بعده. So he stands up to give the speech. He praises Allah, and then he says, to proceed, I have looked into the public affair, and I have sought their counsel, and I have found that they will not choose anyone other than Uthman. And then he says, O Uthman, I pledge allegiance to you according to the sunnah of Allah's Messenger and that of the two Khalifas who came after him. قال نعم, he accepts. فبايعه عبد الرحمن وبايعه المهاجرون والأنصار وأمراء الأجناد والمسلمون وذلك لغرة المحرم بعد دفن عمر رضي الله عنه بثلاثة أيام. And then Abd Rahman pledges his allegiance, and the Muhajirun and the Ansar do the same, and the leaders of the armies and the Muslims in general. And this is at the beginning of Muharram, immediately after the burial of Omar. So this is in the year 24. So it is interesting that the royal principle, which was so universal at the time, doesn't really manifest in any of this. Now, in certain forms of early Shi'i Islam, the idea of primogeniture seems to be evident, even though Ali is not the son of the Holy Prophet, he's his cousin, son-in-law, married to Fatima. So according to the royal understanding of things, he's the heir apparent, the next of kin. So it should be he. So even though many of those who became what academics call the proto-Shia, those who thought it should be Ali, were focusing on his spiritual and historical eminence, there were some also who in the background thought, well, it has to be succession. This is what everybody does. And sometimes some of the theorizing about the Ahlul Bayt, when it gets larger than its due proportion and is no longer in balance, tends to adopt some ideas of primogeniture as some kind of divine right of kings idea, which is clearly not what these people are doing and clearly has no basis in the text of the Quran. So we can talk a little bit about some of his innovations when he actually was a leader. He continues the conquest, and it's always worth bearing in mind that these conquests were done actively with the cooperation of local populations. So he is involved in the throwing out of the Greek elite from Armenia, But most of the fighting, it seems, was actually done by the Armenians themselves. So Monophysites and not Diophysites did accept the theology of the great church in Constantinople. And it's the same with the conquest of Egypt under Omar, that there's a lot of resentment in religious minorities in the very cosmopolitan, complex, ancient world that is used by the early Muslim conquerors and finds the conquerors as being people who offer a much better deal than the Greek emperors ever did, the Jews in particular, who were more or less subject to systematic persecution, pogrom and annihilation, suddenly found, you can go and live in Jerusalem again. What? Are you the Messiah? A lot of very interesting early Jewish texts from that period and monastic texts which also indicate how the early Khulafa would make donations, benefactions to the monasteries. There's a chronicle by somebody called Pseudo-Cebios that talks a lot about this. And it's an interesting aspect. It's conquest, but it's kind of, people are rather appreciative. It said that it was the Jewish community of Spain who invited the Muslims to invade, even though the Khalifa hadn't got a clue what was happening until news reached him. It took a long time to get news from Gibraltar to Baghdad in those days, and that it was a kind of conquest through collaboration. But that takes us a little bit outside the story today, but this is the liberative dimension of these early conquests that are being done, remember, not in the name of somebody who's wearing a gigantic crown. The English coronation crown is so heavy that the one who wears it has to be taught exactly how to sit, because if you move your head the wrong way, it'll actually break your neck because it's just such a heavy thing. It weighs a ton. These people are not wearing crowns. That's not their style. They're sleeping under a blanket in the masjid and not even giving it a second thought. So that's a different kind of imperial, but not imperial, expansion. But in any case, one of the things that he does is that he creates the first Muslim navy. Because one of the things that Muslim conquest is achieving is creating a unified Near East. The Romans had tried to conquer Persia, but they always failed. This was the Emperor Julian and his ill-fated battles in Iraq. Empires always come to grief in Iraq, it seems. He actually dies on those campaigns. But the Muslims unite the Eastern and the Western world. The only bit that they don't take is to the north, kind of Europe. Partly because Byzantine is getting in the way. Muawiyah besieges Constantinople for a year, but it has walls. And there's also a sense that there's not an awful lot once you get past Constantinople. You just got forests, and in England you would have kind of naked people painted in blue who would appear from the forest and kind of angrily shake spears at you, and why bother? The Romans went as far as Scotland, obviously. Nobody would want Scotland, so Hadrian's Wall, that's really, what have they got? Porridge or something. No, we'd rather stay in Italy. But even England, there wasn't a strong, it wasn't like being in Syria or Spain or some of those amazing places. So it's, again, a little bit outside our compass, but they went 90% of the distance from Medina to Cambridge, so that's not bad. But Europe was kind of invented by these conquests because there'd not been a Europe before. Those places were just part of the Roman Empire, which was basically a Mediterranean empire rather than a European thing. So it's Islam that invented Europe. That's just a matter of historical fact, and no doubt they're really grateful. So this incredible thing is happening while he's reciting the whole Quran in 2 rak'ahs and helping the poor and sleeping in a mosque and so forth. A very extraordinary episode in human history, and is creating the first Muslim navy. And this is still the Sahaba who are engaging in this. So he appoints Muawiyah to be in charge of the campaign against Byzantine Cyprus. غزا معاوية البحر معه عبادة ابن الصامت وامرأته حرام فماتت ودفنت هناك. One of the permanent consequences of those conquests was that maybe the generals, nobody really knows what became of them, but the Sahaba and the Tabi'een still buried in those places and define, as it were, the subterranean deep roots of those places in Islamic terms. So Muawiyah's invasion of Cyprus with Ubadah ibn as-Samit, who again is one of the great 10 promised paradise, his wife Hiram, who had been the wet nurse of the Holy Prophet ﷺ, is on the campaign and dies in Cyprus. And if you've been to Cyprus, an EasyJet goes to Larnaca, that's the cheapest flight. So you land at Larnaca, look out of the window of this plane while everybody is doing their scratch cards and thinking about their duty free. You look out of the window and there is this salt lake and a dome, and that's the tomb of Hiram, one of the Sahaba, and it's, if you actually get to go there, it's very close to the airport. It's a wonderful kind of peaceful place, very simple, and somehow still, maybe it's imagination, maybe it's something deeper, has something of the determination and the sincerity and the humility of primal Islam. Definitely a place to visit. So these people who've not really been outside their tribal hunting grounds before are now everywhere and are becoming spiritual hubs for everywhere. So that's the Hala Sultan Tekke near Larnaca. And until Ataturk put an end to such things, Muslim ships and the Ottoman Navy, whenever they went near Cyprus, would always fire a salute in order to respect Hiram and fly their flags at half-mast out of respect for her. So there's a Muslim navy, Rhodes is captured, the Byzantines counterattack, the famous Battle of the Masts, Ghazwat Dhat al-Sawari, which is one of the great sea battles of history. And a lot of other strategic important decisions. So the port city for Mecca is now no longer Shu'aibah, but will be Jeddah. So the city of Jeddah in Saudi Arabia kind of becomes significant as a result of this geographical decision. He sends embassies everywhere. So the first Muslims who go to Ceylon, Sri Lanka, are his ambassador to the king of Salandip, and there's a shrine for them there to this day. He sends the first Muslim embassy to China, apparently under Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas. They go by sea, which must have been quite a journey. And the Hui Muslims to this day consider that to be the beginning of Islam in China. Sa'ad is said to have met the emperor of the Tang dynasty and called him to Islam, and he gave them permission to spread Islam in China. He strikes the first Muslim coins, and we've already mentioned his Quran policy, the Uthmanic recension. So really busy, and I should try and wind up now. There's a lot to be said about his leadership qualities, but let's just fast forward a little bit and talk about his demise, because there's something interesting here as well. External threats were more or less neutralized, but of course there were internal dissensions. This is the case with any Muslim community, or perhaps any human community, inevitably. There's going to be people who are dissatisfied and people who complain, and there are some, particularly in Egypt, who don't like the governors that Uthman is appointing. Now, Uthman is confident that the old, experienced Meccan elites are now serious enough in their Islam to be, as it were, rehabilitated. So this is again a different kind of revolution. It's not that Russian revolution where you just kill the entire aristocracy and get the proletarians to do the just thing. All of these guys are still there. Abu Sufyan is still there. Muawiyah is in charge of the navy, and they have generations of experience in running things. So he has no hesitation in appointing some of them to significant positions. And there's some people who think this isn't right. These are the people who persecuted the Holy Prophet and killed XYZ Sahabas, and now they're up there again. So this is the main essence of the rumblings against Uthman that come particularly from some of the soldiers who are in Egypt, but also in southern Iraq. And even though he sends ambassadors to try and restrain it, and he calls a council in Medina of 12 of the Sahaba who are in the provinces to try and identify the problem. He sends Usama bin Zayd to Basra, Abdullah bin Omar to Syria, and so forth. The complaints are continuing. Uthman asks everybody to join him for the Hajj so that they can present their complaints. But they come to the Hajj, but they won't say anything because they can see the Sahaba here and they're not on side. These rebels start to take over in Egypt, Kufa, Basra, which looks really serious. Uthman doesn't have enough troops in Medina to re-establish caliphal control there. And he also really doesn't like the idea of Muslims fighting against other Muslims, which since early time has been a kind of no, that just hasn't happened. You fight against Byzantine aristocracy or some Persian knight or whatever, but other Muslims, people saying La ilaha illallah on both sides. And this is part of his hayat, his kind of modesty, his humility. He doesn't want to be the one who will do that. So that's a crisis of leadership, if you like. Should he have sent armies to suppress them? With his charisma and the Sahaba behind him, would have won, presumably, a second wave of conquests. He doesn't. And so they kind of start infiltrating towards the city of Medina. And they come to Medina and they come into the city, and still he will not order them to be fought. They're wandering around the city of Medina, bold as brass with their swords unsheathed and everything, riding their horses. This is the city of the Holy Prophet ﷺ. He doesn't want there to be bloodshed. So he orders people to just let them come. And they encircle his house. He issues the local population of Medina saying, can we get these ruffians out? Can we push them out? And he says, no, there will be no fighting, no shedding of blood in the Holy Prophet's city. The rebels then kind of use force to prevent him from going out to the mosque, and they won't allow any food to enter his house, and they're just around his house protesting. There are some small skirmishes. Al-Hassan bin Ali, who is there at the door, is wounded, defending the house from the skirmishes. And then you have these famous exchanges between Uthman and sometimes his wife, who are on the roof of the house trying to reason with these people. He's doing it directly. صعد عثمان, this is in Bukhari, صعد عثمان يوما على السطح فسمع بعض الناس يقول ابتغوا إلى قتله سبيلا. So Uthman goes up to the roof and he hears some of these people saying, we're going to kill him, find some way of killing him. فقال والله ما أحل الله ولا رسوله قتلي. And he says, by Allah, neither Allah nor his messenger have made my killing halal. سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول لا يحل دم امرئ مسلم إلا بإحدى ثلاث كفر بعد إسلام أو زنا بعد إسلام أو قتل نفس بنفس. I heard the Holy Prophet himself saying, the blood of a Muslim man is not halal unless three things have happened. Kufr, after Islam, or zina, adultery, without any excuse, or murder. This is what the Holy Prophet has said. وَمَا فَعَلْتُ مِنْ ذَلِكَ شَيْئًا. I've done none of those things. ثم قال لا أخلف رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم في أمته بإحراق محجم من دم حتى ألقاه. I will not go against the Holy Prophet's wishes for his ummah by shedding a single drop of Muslim blood until I meet Allah. He says, what do you want? And they said, resign, so that we can choose whoever we want. And he said, I will not take off a garment which Allah has caused me to wear. وإما أن تقتلوني فوالله لئن قتلتموني لا تتحابون بعدي أبدا ولا تقاتلون بعدي عدوا جميعا. So he makes this prediction, which is still absolutely upon us today. He says, if you kill me, you will never love one another ever again. and you will never be together again against any enemy. It's kind of talking to the whole ummah. If you kill me, that's the end of the unity of the ummah. You won't have this mutual love ever again. Muslims will not be completely united. Ala qalbi rajulin wahid, with the heart of a single man. And you will never again be united in confronting an enemy. And then they start shooting arrows. Some of them climb the back wall. It's just a house. حتى دخلوا على عثمان رضي الله عنه وهو قاعد والمصحف في حجره ومعه امرأته والناس فوق السطح. And then they burst in on Uthman while he was sitting, and the Quran on his lap and his wife beside him, and there were people on the roof. And then somebody called Ibn Ramad attacked him. His wife Na'ila throws herself over her husband to protect him, and her fingers are cut off. Uthman is killed. ثم خرجوا هاربين من حيث دخلوا. And then they've run away, fleeing in the direction from which they'd entered. So his wife Na'ila, even though she's wounded, goes out to give the news. فلما دخلوا وجدوا عثمان مذبوحا فانكبوا عليه يبكون. And when the people came in, they found Uthman had been stabbed to death, and they kind of were weeping and threw themselves upon him. And the news came to Ali, Talha and Zubayr, فكادت عقولهم تذهب لعظم الخبر. And they almost lost their minds, so immense was this news. قال Ali said, كيف قتل أمير المؤمنين أنتما على الباب؟ قال لم نعلم. So he says to his sons, Hassan and Hussein, who according to most of the historians are at the door defending the house, how could you allow the Amir al-Mu'mineen to be killed when you were at the door? And they said, we didn't know. The rebels are pursued, most of them are killed. Uthman buried 3 days later after a khilafah of 12 years as a shaheed. There doesn't need to be a ghusl, a washing of his body. And some other accounts of his last moments. It was kind of just an act of kind of mad vengefulness, mob rule, a kind of wild mentality that takes over a group, like the Gilets jaunes in Paris, a kind of crowd mentality that is quite animalistic. And of course they're mortified, many of them, at what has been done, and it's only Imam Ali Karamallahu Wajhahu who comes afterwards, even though he's traumatized by this event and had no part in it, who manages to bring the Muslims together again. But from that time, where he says, you'll never love each other all together again, the Ummah has had these fitnas within it. Different groups and tribes, and now nations, and the Sunnah, and the Shia, and the Zaydiyya, and the Ismailiyya, and the Ibadiyya, and the Salafiyya, and everything. That's been the Ummah, whereas at the beginning it was just a single garment on rent by any hand. So it's a climacteric moment, but we live in dunya, and unity of a huge human collectivity in dunya is rarely to be sought. This is just how things are. But that is not the key memory that we have of him. Instead, we have the memory of the man who was the man of modesty, but the man who built this great navy, and the man who sent the army against Constantinople, and the man who said that the Byzantines can have their lands back once it's been conquered, and the man who slept under a blanket in the mosque, and the man who married two of the daughters of the best of creation, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, quite extraordinary. So the take-home really is, leadership is not about kind of standing up straight, beating your chest, and being the alpha male Tarzan. Yeah, there is a certain magnificence to masculinity that has its haqq, that everybody recognizes. The warrior is a hero. But the warrior without ego, that's a more interesting personality. The one who is not Tarzan roaring and beating his chest saying, look at me, but the one who is dignified because of lack of ego rather than because of self-regard. That's the Islamic ideal, the prophetic ideal, which is why these people also represent Sunnah. By any of these stars, you'll be guided. Try and be like Uthman, you'll be amazing. So yes, diversity is not offended by the principle of Sunnah, but is in fact purified and released to be itself. All of those khulafa were really different people. How they came to power was really different in each case, but they all represent extensions of the same prophetic light and the same Sunnah. So in our diverse times, we need to kind of remember that and be less freaked out by differences amongst ourselves. The Bangladeshi and the Pakistani and the Sunni and the Salafi. And, you know, well, there is a place for heterogeneity in this ummah. It's an ummah of the spectrum of the colours that are beautifully unfurled. It's not ideology, it's deen. And this ikhtilaf is how things are divinely decreed to be. Barakallahu fikum wal afu minkum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Cambridge Muslim College, training the next generation of Muslim thinkers.